third of those remains have no potential claimant. A couple years ago, the number of remains being bandied about in the press was 630,000. I understand that as the counting has proceeded, the number is now over 1 million. That means that some 300,000, 500,000 remains are going to have no claimant. What will happen with those remains?
I would ask Jim to answer that.
Well, that's going to be new territory for us. We've talked about that. We do have remains that are unidentified. We don't believe in the term unaffiliated, or we don't work that way. I know that's kind of goes against the NAGPRA legislation, but somebody's a close relative. Somebody somewhere is a cousin or a close relative. If let's say if you passed away, you didn't have any children, you had $1 million, and no children or a spouse to inherit the money. I bet you'd bet there'd be some cousins out there that would be interested in getting a hold of that money. Well, it's not quite the same thing with human remains, but at least there are other people who may be interested in taking on that responsibility if we can't find a direct lineal descendant. And if there isn't anybody out there who may be closely related to those remains, then we may decide ourselves to take responsibility for the disposition of those remains when the time comes. So that's something that most museums haven't thought about or may be interested in, but we are. And we feel that every human remain, whether it's native or non-native, deserves a certain amount of respect. So when the time comes, we'll decide what to do with about the remains that are unidentified, but we believe that every set of remains, if they came from the ground, they need to go back to the ground and be treated respectfully. So I don't know if anybody else wants to add to that or not.
I guess you covered it all.
Well, I guess in a traditional sense, at least what's related to me by my elders, is that even if that possibility, which I'm sure it's going to be a reality, for us anyway, and understanding and respecting that the humanity of it all, it's really beneath us in that sense. I mean, it's really just logistics in that sense of giving back and returning, but when those circumstances arise, it's really about the return. And I guess in that sense, some of those people we no longer know or understand, and certainly the sciences are making that attempt. But there's no really way of knowing, understanding where that point of return is in that way. But in more in a symbolic sense, our understanding of it is that it's just even below us, if that's where the return has to be. So, but
yeah, I used the example last night. I live not too far from Arlington National Cemetery, and you know, at Arlington there's the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. Nobody knows who that soldier is, or several soldiers that are in the tomb. Yet they've had a proper disposition. They're not housed in a warehouse somewhere. And so we try to extend that same amount of respect to the American Indian remains that we have in our collections as well. Human dignity.
I just want to touch on one other aspect of this, which has been that in some cases the documentation the museums have is very poor. In other words, remains were taken with little or no documentation, so it's very difficult to ascertain, you know, where they came from specifically, or there might be a general sense of where they came from, but not a specific sense of what nation they may have belonged to. That because there were perhaps the funerary objects, if there were funerary objects, were left and the remains were taken, therefore there's no context either. You don't have enough information simply, and that pertains to a lot more remains than I think most people know.
I just wanted to ask, obviously all of you on the panel have a special relationship, either in work or in life or both, to the objects and sacred objects and cultures of Native Americans. And Jim and Terry, you spoke about repatriation and traditional care in class yesterday as issues, human rights issues, issues of human dignity, and I hear these terms coming up tonight too. Now, I think it's also the case that many of the objects that are in museum collections now came into the possession of museums through colonialism that is similar to the colonialism that was visited upon, obviously, the native peoples of this land. And I'm just wondering if you could say something about whether you think the case of repatriation and traditional care might be applicable to the sacred or religious objects of other cultures and even human remains that might be in the possession of other museums, if you would. Thanks.
No. Well, I don't think that's an issue in the sense that individual cultures and indigenous cultures or world nations and peoples have their own integrity about what their understanding what their culture is and those religions. I certainly respect the boundaries that are established by various other religions without question. And sometimes in that sense, I think Native people in this country ask the same thing be done with our culture. So, but also in that sense, it is a general humanity question in terms of repatriation, and it's really an issue for various kinds of institutions. It's really just an issue of cultural property and intellectual property, and what does that really infer? And I don't want to go on another tangent here because it's going to get too far off the track. I just had to raise one question in a sense, and maybe I hope somebody can answer that. Not necessarily from the panel. I know these guys too well, but just in a sense of what is it? Why is it so important in that sense of what's happened and what's transpired during the Vietnam War, and what's the significance of needing to have these people come back? And I think it really relates to the same kind of issue of bringing those people back. And those are warriors, the same way a lot of these peoples were. They were also victims of campaigns, which a lot of these people were. So in that sense, I mean, it really isn't a different question. It's just the same. And humanity is just that. So we have to respect it all. Thanks.
I've been a part of a couple of different panel discussions that related to art taken during the Holocaust. And I found that there's a similar dialogue there where you're talking about things that were taken from people who had no way to protect themselves or to prevent that from happening, and only now are these issues of the Holocaust and who really owns these same things coming to a global discussion, and people are beginning to question the right of museums to hold some of these collections and the provenance of these collections. So at that level, I think the people can relate to what we're saying, that we're faced with a similar issue and a similar attachment to these things which we consider sacred. It's a different issue when you come to human remains, because I think when you come to human remains, there are some really horrible practices that the American Army carried out here against Indian people, and this is part of the history of this country. I make the point that America suffers from cultural amnesia and likes to keep it that way, because to address those issues is to open up a Pandora's box of many, many things, and repatriation is part of that.
Yes, please. Maybe this will be the last question. Everybody's burned up.
Too many questions, actually, to contain it in one. So things I'm concerned about are memory. And one was what Pete Jemison brought up about the loss of memory. Sorry, the mic doesn't seem to be working, so I'll talk loud. Okay, it's good. And that is the sense of the loss of precious individuals who would give continuity in memory. And then the complexity of standing on two sides of a complicated culture, as American culture is for all of you who've negotiated institutional identities as well as tribal and traditional identities. I had a friend who was a Jesuit and also taught me Sumerian, because my field is the Old World, it's the ancient Near East. And he was a priest, and every Christmas Eve at midnight mass, he would stand up and conduct part of the service, and I always went because he ran the music as well, and he was a dear friend, and said, creation happened 3,225 years ago, and it would be presented as part of the belief system of the ritual in which he was deeply committed. At the same time, he knew that the Sumerian he was teaching me was a language that was already 5,000 years old at best, and maybe 7,000 years old, and that there was a conflict even in him between the tradition to which he adhered and the scholarly tradition of which he was a practitioner. So I would guess that it's not just a conflict between a belief system that's a traditional one and a scientific system that's easy to make into the bad guy because it's done some pretty bad things, but must have to be worked out within each of the communities about identity today. And so half of me wants to ask you personal questions about your own identity formations and becomings, but there is a part of me that wants to ask how the community is renewing itself and dealing with belief systems that are sometimes in conflict with other systems of knowledge, and renewing the loss of memory when you don't have people still there to tell you how the wampum belt was used and or how a mask was used, but who don't want to leave necessarily the sacred object in the possession of an institution, want to bring it home and want to feel that it's been dealt with respectfully. There must be a degree of invention or reinvention that's perceived to be legitimate within the tradition that allows you to reinscribe ritual even if the memory of performance is gone. And I'm very interested in how a culture renews itself in that way, if any of you would care to comment.
Well, let me just talk briefly about a little bit of what you said, or you asked about there. On the one hand, the thing that we really adhere to in our own communities is to keep the, if you will, speeches that are related to a ceremonial practice intact, to not change those, to not add to those, to not bring new things into it, but to keep it as it was, because it was that speech that was given to them in the beginning. It is that information that they were given in the beginning. Some might have slipped away over the years, but to the best of our ability, we work to keep the words in there that are essential to communicate with these beings, these forces that are there that have been provided to us for, and we only can care for them. Okay, so on the one hand, in that area there isn't a lot of invention going on. Okay, because that's really not the way we think. On the other hand, given the facts of our present time, we are faced with losing those people who have, and this is a factor of boarding schools, it's a factor of the kind of education system that our parents and our grandparents were convinced that our people should, well, in some cases the Bureau of Indian Affairs, in some cases it was, one or another religious denomination, and, various things that really put a certain kind of thinking in our communities about the value of our language and about the importance of gaining a knowledge of English and being able to speak as I'm speaking to you, using your language. And so, so this brings us to the point where we are now, where we're hanging on to our language, and surprisingly, nations bigger than us are faced with the same questions. I mean, the Navajo Nation is facing the same issues about language retention that the Seneca Nation is facing. So we then look at how do we do that? At what age do we begin these young people? And under what circumstances can we focus them so that the maximum amount of learning will take place and that they will carry on this speech, as I said before, without invention, without elaboration that was not a part of the original. And so that is ongoing in our community as well. And then you have people who came from families in which the families maintain this tradition, and therefore those are the people that move in a way to the place where they then take care of those responsibilities that their father before them and perhaps their grandfather before that did. So there's a little bit of all of that in there, but it isn't easy. I mean, the physical, separateness that we now live in, and the way in which our communities are, function, and all the things that are part of our lives today, don't make this easy. But we are fortunate, we feel, in many ways, that the people who were very important to any of the repatriation work that we have done are still present in our communities. And the degree to which we are intact is unbelievable. We are true survivors. If you look at the East Coast and the groups that still use their language and that still carry out their entire ceremonial cycle, those, you can put them in the palm of your hand.
Coming from the Pueblo world, our traditions where I come from the Pueblo of San Alfonso, are, we have been living in that location for almost 500-600 years. Yes, we have lost a lot. And one of the exhibits that we had a number of years ago at the Museum of Mexico sort of reflects how we feel about who we are and where we are, is that here, now, and always. If you remember that, Bruce, is that we feel that we always been here. That yes, we may have come from a distant, far away from where we are now, but we can trace back because of oral traditions where we came from. But I'm fortunate to be part of my community at this time, because a lot of our traditions and songs and dances we are reviving. Number of dances and ceremonies that we have now in our community I have never seen. Because why? Because we feel at our generation that if we don't do those traditions and songs and dances, we're going to lose them forever. Again, the question why is because many of our older generation, our elders, are dying off. We have very few elders in our community that we can turn to ask questions. How do we do certain things? Our generation have the burden of taking on the responsibility of continuing those traditions to our sons and daughters and grandchildren. And we tell our children is that your generation have to continue those traditions, because if you don't, your generation is going to lose everything. The language is very important. Like Pete is saying, language is something that will continue the survival of the culture and the dances. Without it, they die. And so we are fortunate that we have very strong tribal leaders telling the younger generation you have to continue. But it's a struggle because of the outside influences that we have. Yes, my grandfather told me a long time ago, he said, go out in the non-Indian world, learn those things in that white man's world, but come home and help your own people. And I think I'm doing that. But there's a conflict sometimes between being, I'm a Pueblo Indian first, and a park employee second, and I can be no other. And sometimes it is a struggle, because there are certain things that I do within my own program that conflicts within my beliefs, but I have to stay out of it. But we are fortunate in my world that, I can say we have photographs of certain dances that date back to the 1880s and 2001. They haven't changed except the people. So those traditions, many of traditions and societies and plans have died away. Certain things we don't have, but the core of the thing is still there. So
I'd like to thank everyone for their attention tonight, to the Center for the Study of World Religions for having us here, Dr. Sullivan, Allison Edwards, thank you very much for all your efforts as well. I'd like to thank all the panelists for their terrific comments. As I understand it, next week on the 25th of April at 1 o'clock, we'll be having a web-based discussion about the same. And I think you can go to Allison or Kathy here, get more information about that. She's shaking her head yes. Again, I'd like to thank the panelists for just a great discussion. I appreciate you all coming. And thank you all for your attention.